Hello, good morning or afternoon, depending on where you may be. Thanks for joining us for this important panel, a virtual fireside chat with current and former administration leaders on issues related to cell therapies. I'm very pleased to be joined today by this distinguished panel. I'm Mark McClellan. I'm the director of the Duke-Margolis Center for Health Policy and have the privilege of having been the FDA commissioner from 2000. The FDA commissioner from 2002 to 2004 and CMS administrator after that. Joining me on the panel is the current director of the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research at the Food and Drug Administration, Dr. Peter Marks. Also joined by Dr. Andrew von Eschenbach, who's currently president of Samaritan Health Initiatives Incorporated and adjunct professor at the University of Texas MD Anderson Cancer Center, also former commissioner of the Food and Drug Administration and former director of the National Cancer Institute. And we're joined by Dr. Rob Califf, head of health strategy and policy at Google and Verily Health, and a former commissioner of the Food and Drug Administration as well. So very pleased to have all of you with us today. Peter, if you don't mind, I'd like to start with you. You are literally at the center of the action of some of the most important decisions about, from a regulatory standpoint, that are affecting the American public.
Peter, you're muted. There you go.
Thanks. I think Mark may have just slipped off there.
Yeah.
I'm going to jump in and just say that, yeah, so we right now at the Center for Biologics, we in our remit have a combination of several different products which are of interest right now. We were the center that issued an emergency use authorization for convalescent plasma. We have the COVID-19 vaccines coming in, a few other therapeutics, and of course we have products related to stem cells and gene therapies. And there have been actually several cell therapy products that have been submitted under investigation of drug applications in terms of a group of them in aggregate, several that I can just say that under the heading of exosome therapies for the acute lung injury in COVID-19. So it's been an interesting time where we've been very busy with a lot of different products, and at the same time we're still trying to keep the normal freight moving, which is trying to advance the regulation of cell therapies. We did, because of the amount of distraction that I think people have had with COVID-19, we did extend our period of enforcement discretion that was originally supposed to end in November of this year to end in May, at the end of May of 2021, because it has been difficult for people to get trials done. It has been difficult for people to go about their business doing regulatory filing. So we're still trying to keep that process moving, but we acknowledge that it might be going a little slower than it might have in the past because of COVID-19.
And in terms of COVID and regenerative medicine, cellular therapies, and there's some companies and researchers out there who have treatments that they'd like to bring to bear on the pandemic from these areas. Any comments about what you're seeing there in general? It is a really challenging time since we need progress at pandemic speed, and many of these therapies are newer.
Yeah, so we've had quite a number of people come in with potential therapies. I think the most challenging piece of this has been we've been able to turn them around relatively quickly in general. We've tried to turn around for COVID-19 related INDs within a week if they're for a really important indication. probably the most challenging thing has been people's having a little bit less of a understanding that we really do still need manufacturing information if something is going to be used in multiple individuals. We're very understanding when it comes to single patient investigational new drug applications, emergency investigation new drug applications, where we will generally give a fair amount of latitude on the amount of manufacturing information provided. But what has happened for some people have not understood that if you're going to be using something of patients as part of an investigation of drug application, we do need to understand how the product's made. And so that's probably, if there's been a theme to some of the applications here, it's been needing to understand that we do need to understand how these products are made. In some cases, it's been challenging because people who actually want to use the products are not necessarily the people who make the products, and they're procuring them from another entity, and that other entity may not always have a robust amount of manufacturing information on hand. So I think this shows some of the complexity in this field of regenerative medicine, of providers trying to do their best, getting products from those who they're trying to rely on, and sometimes not knowing for sure that all has been done appropriately on the standpoint of those entities that are providing the therapies.
Yeah, and these are complex manufacturing processes in many cases. Well, Peter, thanks for those introductory comments. Andy, I know you've spent a lot of time thinking about cellular products, regenerative medicine in a lot of areas. Any initial thoughts about where we are and where we should be headed?
Yeah. Well, first of all, Peter, thank you. I know that you and others at the agency have really tried to always be very supportive and helping provide guidance, helping to provide kind of a direction as to how people can approach this. And so the issue I think has been emerging is that we see these cell therapies maybe playing in two completely different arenas. There's the portion of cell therapies that may be playing a role in modulating the immune response. And of course, prior to COVID, saw a lot of activity in that area in immuno-oncology and CAR T cells, et cetera. And the question there is as investigators are coming forward with possibilities and opportunities for these cell therapies to participate in or modulate the immune response to COVID, or even perhaps be playing a role that could facilitate the vaccine process by virtue of what cell therapies have to do to enhance the antibody response. How is the agency thinking and approaching guidance and working with developers so that they get it right? If they have, for example, one of the things that I've been involved in, in full disclosure, on the board of Cellularity, there's been an interest early on with the role that NK cells might be playing in this particular pandemic by virtue of its association with age and our knowledge that NK cells are depleted with aging, or that they switch from NK bright to NK dim and are not as good as they should be in that first line of defense. So on that side of the equation, could you shed some light on where you think the FDA can guide and direct these developmental processes so they get it right?
Yeah, so I think part of this is not so much even in the guidance aspect, because we have some reasonable guidance out there. Part of it, I think, is probably having early conversations with what our expectations are as things are moving forward, in terms of having people understand what we expect for a product for manufacturing as it progresses, because oftentimes we'll have a one standard that we'll be comfortable with for early development, and we'll want to see perhaps more battened down manufacturing as it moves into a into a more advanced development or a pivotal trial. I think those conversations, we will take responsibility that in COVID, it's been a little challenging because we've been so busy that the time to get those conversations to happen is much longer than I'd like it to be. It's something we're also trying to think about remedying as we move into the next cycle of user fee negotiations by staffing up, because I don't feel like small business entities can't wait 90 to 120 days to get feedback on like that through an informal interaction. So we're going to try to ramp that up. But I do think that the agency has a lot of collective knowledge from working with a lot of different companies that we can't tell people about somebody else's application, but we can at least share with them the wisdom that we've gained from seeing the mistakes that people have made. And that can be very, very valuable, because in some cases, you might say, well, the agency's just going to tell them you got to do X number more things than you need to do, and it's just going to be a lot extra work. But oftentimes, when we have people come in, they actually leave relieved or shocked that we don't need certain things. And so that's part of this, is that sometimes people are pleasantly surprised that when they come in for a meeting, that we tell them, no, you don't need to do this tox study because it's not going to be meaningful. So I think that dialogue is so important. I think that's been actually something that's been highlighted during this COVID-19 period, is that over communication sometimes is a good thing. And in this particular case, being able to facilitate that early on, and the nice thing about early on is because you're not in that more formal phase of discussion, like when you are in a phase 3 trial and you're about to have a regulatory submission, the discussion can be more relaxed, and I think we can provide really good advice in a less formal manner that I think helps people.
That's great.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. Rob, you've been involved in evidence development in a whole lot of areas, including in the COVID context. Any initial thoughts or reactions of what you're hearing with respect to cellular therapies and regenerative medicine right now?
Well, I mean, I had a really interesting time struggling with Peter in 21st Century Cures to get legislation to what seemed to be a reasonable place, and I think
But you did, right?
we it wasn't perfect by my estimation, but it got to a pretty good place. And just to remind people who wouldn't have known about this, I actually was in the chain of command for a BLA from Peter's organization before I went to FDA for placental stem cells in Joanne Kurtzberg's lab. So I got to be the recipient of a 1 week long interrogation as part of that process when they came for the site visit and inspections. So
that's that later stage communication that Peter was alluding to earlier, right? Not this early stage friendly discussion.
Yeah. And so, I think the science and the biology, I think we all know there's something there. And if we could figure it out and get the right components in the right person at the right time, sort of like what's happening, I think, with convalescent plasma and antibodies. It's of note, the announcement from Lilly today that looks like they have some positive results, but not a home run by any means. So it's going to be complicated. So when I look at it, and Peter, I'm very interested in your, I'll be a little bit provocative, and I'll be interested in hearing how you synthesize this, because the field of regenerative medicine, is amazing in the science, but the clinical evidence is very difficult to some extent because of what I call the home brew problem. Every place is doing its own version, and then it becomes very hard to get adequate sized clinical trials to really prove what's effective and what's not. And then in addition to that, you've got, frankly, fake people and charlatans out there taking advantage of the biomedical regulatory lapses that occur because of the practice of medicine components and claims that are made. and people making a lot of money on things that probably don't work, all mixed in with the things that do work. And part of the effort we had in 21st Century Cures was to try to get a framework for clinical trials to be done in an organized fashion. And now we add on top of it the COVID problem, where again, forget regenerative medicine, we have many, many highly prominent studies that are completely worthless, and many that turn out to actually be flat out wrong or fake in the literature. Somewhere in there, there's good stuff. And so the question for me is, how do we sort out the stuff that's good and get the right studies done to get an answer in a field that already had a lot of issues in this regard, but now, like all COVID therapies, is under tremendous pressure.
Yeah.
That's an easy
question. Rob, it's not just getting, sorting out which studies are good, but how do we encourage more good studies the right studies to be done? That's certainly been a challenge in COVID.
Yes.
Yeah. Peter, you seem to be getting a disproportionate share of the questions, but that's
it's okay. It's okay. It comes with the territory. This is a really good question. I think Rob really brings up an important point here that I just want to step back and say that one of the problems with cellular therapies right now is sorting out signal from noise. There are a lot of people out there putting stuff forward that really isn't scientific, that's not advancing the field. They're not really selling any, they're not really studying something, they're just selling something. So they don't know that there's all this noise of stuff that doesn't really, is it possible it works? Yeah, I guess it's possible, but nobody really knows that it works, and it probably doesn't in most of these cases. There's a bunch of stuff out there that's creating noise, and there's a portion of cellular therapies that probably are effective, and some of them are probably more effective and less effective, and we never get sometimes to iterate on those because there's so much other noise around. That you don't see the kind of collaboration and systematic study and iteration on things that we really need to see. I mean, just think about, as I think about, the use of mesenchymal stem cells, or whatever you want to call those cells, for immunomodulation, rather than, getting an answer in a disease, getting some positive, hopefully getting some small positive result, and then figuring out, well, if we did higher dose, if we gave it at earlier stage of disease, and iterate to make progress. There's been a desire to try to kind of move past some of the grunt work that you just got to do in drug development. There's nothing magic. I mean, cells are the only magic about cells is that they're several orders of magnitude more complex than small molecules, right? Because they're literally tens of thousands of large molecules and small molecules combined. So the idea that you'd be able to kind of sprint over what we need to do in other drug development in terms of going through this kind of gradual understanding, incremental progress, is kind of surprising to me. And I think that's why there's been some disappointment. I think we probably should recalibrate expectations to thinking that maybe we should try to get to first base with cellular therapies, see that they actually bring benefit, then trying to get, a double, then a triple, and then maybe a home run. I mean, it is true. Sometimes we see this in the small molecule drug world. You get a home run. You just get lucky that that you have one of the imatinibs of this world, a drug that is able to put a cancer into remission in a large number of the patients treated with it. But most of the time, there's small incremental benefit. And I think the fact that there's people are not in it often for that, get to first base, get to second base. You still win baseball games that way. And that's kind of, I think, at least from my perspective, some of what the thinking has to be in here, that people don't get so disappointed when they don't have a home run, that getting to first base or second base is still good. You can see I played baseball with my kids when they were younger too much, perhaps.
Rob, that does seem like, to your point about, is there a better way to sort of support aiming for signals? I know one of the concerns in the field is that research funding isn't as much as it should be. You know, obviously, if there's more research funding involved, it could be directed maybe towards supporting some of these goals. Do you see any practical ways to get more clarity about the singles and the foundational steps that could help accelerate progress across the field? And Andy, I'm going to come to you with a similar question next.
Yeah, I will be very interested in Andy's view, because he's more involved on the corporate side than I am right now in this field. Not that I'm not involved in the corporate side and other things right now dealing with Alphabet, but I mean, to me, one of the problems in this field has been the evidence is generated in drugs and devices because companies have a hurdle they have to get over with the FDA. And it's accepted that the company is going to get a return on investment for its investment in the research, and that it won't get the permission to market unless it crosses that hurdle and funds the research that's needed. In this field, you know, a lot of it's been developed in medical centers and institutions, which is the homebrew issue that I referred to. So there is no commercial model for investment and then return on investment. Now, I think what has happened, and part of what Peter and I were talking about 3 years ago, is how do we modify the approach of CBER to make it more enticing for the corporate part to come in, you know, with a good chance of return on investment if a good job is done. And it feels like progress has been made there. But I feel like, frankly, the NIH and FDA together could do a better job on the, I'll call it the academic side, of making the research networks more robust and effective. And then the corporate world, I think, is moving along, but there may be other things that can be done to get the same kind of investment in the high quality clinical research that's needed to prove the benefits and risks, not just the theory, but to actually prove it.
Yeah, Rob, this is Peter. I think I just want to echo. I take your criticism there, or the point, very well, because I think what you don't have are the networks that need to be developed here so that investigators can work together using high quality science. So what ends up happening is, since you don't have people working together, often you're right, it's left to individual investigators and individual institutions to use whatever they can leverage in those places. And I think if there was a sponsorship of kind of a more aggressive program here of having cross-institutional work networks that helped build upon simple protocols, you maybe could make more progress. I mean, I think this concept that Scott Gottlieb and I wrote about, of this kind of joint development, collaborative development programs, could be something that could be facilitated here, where you could have manufacturing of simple products by a very aligned methods at different locations, so that you could have what is hopefully a very similar, if not the same product, studied in different locations, albeit not manufactured in the traditional large single center manufacturing site, but manufactured locally, studied locally, and then pooling the data so we actually get answers in a relatively shorter period of time that are robust. And I think what I hear when people start to try to do this is they just don't have the infrastructure in place to be able to work with a number of other institutions to get those answers in a timely manner. You know, you see onesies and twosies of two institutions trying to participate, and they still can't get enough patients to make it happen in a timely manner. because some of these, I think what you are alluding to here is that the challenge with cell therapies is that the cycle time in terms of how you'd like to iterate is a little bit more like devices. You don't want to have to, it's not like a small molecule drug where, 8 years down the line, you're going to make it the same way you made it 8 years previously, largely. So you don't have to worry about process improvement here. Since that's tending to evolve, you'd like to potentially study various iterations of a product. And right now that's just too cumbersome. And I think part of that is not an FDA problem. Part of that is that we just don't have the networks out there to study things in a facile manner.
Andy, what do you think about the potential for a joint collaborative to facilitate sort of incremental and clearer, more confident progress in some of the key areas of cellular therapy?
I think it's absolutely critical, and kind of harkens back a little bit to a previous experience by one of your predecessors, Peter, when we were faced with the prospects of an avian influenza pandemic, and we were really not very well equipped with regard to our infrastructure for vaccine development at the time. And CBER worked collaboratively and cooperatively with those companies that were interested and willing to re-engage in vaccine development to really create the partnership that brought them up to the standards that you would be accepting as the regulator, but they knew that they would be facilitated in that development process. So I think there's opportunities that goes along with where you opened with regard to the proactive role of the FDA in engaging both with the research community as well as with the developmental community to really create the pathway and the opportunities for this to move both efficiently as well as effectively. I think there's maybe been a significant missed opportunity that perhaps we can still capture. I think with a lot of the funding that came out of Congress for our approaching COVID, significant investments and appropriate ones in vaccine development. I think there could have been a lot more funding and a lot more attention given to spurring on the same kind of engagement in antivirals as well as in cell therapies. So perhaps that's still an opportunity going forward to build out the infrastructure and the resources that are necessary to drive more of the preclinical development and answers that you need as they come to the agency for approval. We're clearly going to have a need for a lot more even after the vaccine, because we're seeing issues like long hauler syndrome, where even the survivors are going to be having problems that are going to need to be addressed with cardiac insufficiencies, pulmonary insufficiency, et cetera, all of which are fertile opportunities for cell therapies, but those opportunities are going to have to be done in the disciplined, rigorous, precise way that you're calling for. And so if the funding's there to look at those post-COVID issues, that could help spur the research and the development side of the equation. We're seeing companies like just Takeda's recent announcement and others have come into the field of really standardizing and building out the manufacturing quality and capacity that you alluded to. And if the agency can work effectively on that side, on the development side, for them to get that right, then the standards for quality manufacturing could be more widely disseminated. So to sum it up, I think we need more funding because the problems of COVID are not going to go away. A lot of that funding could be opportune in the whole area of regenerative medicine and cell therapies. And the central core role of the FDA to be the guide and facilitator as well as the regulator, I think is critical. And you need the support to make that happen. So we need to be advocating for resources for you to build that infrastructure so that you can be the facilitating agency that you alluded to earlier.
Yeah, I can definitely see the advantages of more funding to support this, and hopefully building on some of the 21st Century Cures efforts that Rob alluded to earlier, and a lot of the participants in this meeting would like to see that happen too. In addition to the federal funding, are there other ways to bring resources together? Andy, you mentioned some. To Rob's point, you mentioned some commercial interest in this area. There obviously are a number of academic centers involved. We've seen pre-competitive industry collaborations emerge in other areas around pharma manufacturing, around validation of markers, things that things that help everybody in the field work more clearly together. Is there room for, in the absence of new federal funding, something like that happening here? I'm not sure if that's a better question for Rob or Andy, but would appreciate any thoughts on how to move this notion forward without necessarily having to wait for the funding.
Yeah, I think one of the silver linings on this COVID experience is, and I don't know if you all share this view, but I certainly have never seen the degree of collaboration and cooperation that's emerged in response to this pandemic. And hopefully we can build on that. We can keep that kind of collaborative interaction. We're all in this together, so that we are able to float all the boats. And so if we seize this opportunity around regenerative medicine, both on the immunomodulating side as well as on the restoration and regenerative side for long hauler syndrome, and create those academic collaborations as well as those commercial collaborations, I think we'll be light years ahead of everybody trying to go it on their own and struggling and not having an adequate amount of critical mass. I don't know if you guys share that view of unprecedented cooperation. Hopefully it won't go away after the pandemic is behind us, so we can keep it going. But Rob, what your thoughts on collaboration, cooperation?
Well, I'd say there's been unprecedented enthusiasm and volunteerism. But I'd say we still suffered, particularly in the US, from the fragmentation issue and some of the incentives that we have, particularly in I'll call it the academic side or the health system side, where, at least in my view, there's still too much tendency for people to want to do little small studies if they can publish them and get their name on the paper. And the rush to preprints has created an even more serious situation where some of the stuff is flat out wrong because people are rushing to be first out there with a preprint and then tweet about it. I know the purpose today is not to talk about preprints, but and I'm generally in favor. We just have to work out how to do it. So I wish, what I would wish for is that we bottle the enthusiasm and the volunteerism and the willingness to sacrifice, people working 24/7 to do what they can do, and then direct it in a way that leads to a coordinated effort that really produces results. Or another way of saying is, why can the UK reel off 3 or 4 important results almost right away with high quality randomized trials while we're still having committee meetings in the US about all the different people and what credit they're going to get? That sounds a little caustic, but I think if you look at the output of the two countries relative to the capacity for output, it's sort of what happened.
Yeah. Rob, I'm willing to raise you on that one by saying that what shocked me in this crisis was the fact that I feel like some of the corporate entities were kind of shaken up to work together in ways. We saw that with immune globulin manufacturers. We saw that with some of the vaccine manufacturers. They were shaken up to work together in ways that were unique, ways they were not doing pre-pandemic. and yet I've been impressed when on some conversations in various committees where a number of academics, it seems like it's almost business as usual. And that's been a little bit shocking to me. And I've wondered why, I've just, it's been kind of a mystery to me why we haven't been able to move past that. And it's relevant, I think, to cell therapies, because I think the problem we end up with cell therapies is especially in academic institutions, the concept of being part of these of multi-center studies in this area has not been as attractive as well. If I do one cell therapy in my institution, I can do these correlative studies, and it's very easy with these cell therapies to get very busy doing all sorts of science that goes along with it, but that science doesn't always move the entire bar forward from a clinical perspective. So I'm being a little provocative here deliberately, but it's a challenge here. And I think the challenge is in cell therapy is to do two things at once. Yes, we need to understand the basic therapy, the basic science behind the therapy, but at the same time, I think we kind of need to advance the clinical aspects of this, and the current setup is essentially impeding the clinical progress just because of I think you might say it as the academic reward that comes from that isn't from participating in these multi-institutional trials isn't great enough. And so unless there's some financial incentive that comes with that, ultimately, I don't know how we get that to work right.
Yeah. Are you all seeing any of you some good models for doing that? Peter mentioned hyperimmune globulin, where I think the companies have gotten together. They have a randomized trial, I think, underway now or getting underway now that is intended to get to a better powered answer in a well-designed study. Any other kind of foundational or examples to point to?
Well, it's not exactly on your point, but in talking about collaborations and bringing groups together, I mean, we're all familiar with the work that the Reagan-Udall Foundation and Friends of Cancer Research have done in terms of convening a community around real-world evidence so that there's collaboration and cooperation to set the standards, to define the pathway to the discipline of getting the data right in the first place, figure out ways to aggregate the data, and then work towards analytics so that it becomes a useful tool. So there's one example of what was a process of convening. Someone had to catalyze that bringing together, and then there were self-interest that became apparent that working together could get your particular program a little further ahead. And I think we need that kind of culture of enlightened self-interest as to why collaboration works best. But just to quickly follow that with a question back to Peter. Peter, do you think in this field that there are, you mentioned that the problem that's plagued the field is that there are some really excellent investigators, and yet at the same time, there are people who are perhaps snake oil salesmen, to use that term. Do you think that there's a critical mass of highly reputable, highly credible, scientifically based, disciplined clinical investigators that could be brought together by a convener, and we can talk about who that convener might be, to sort of create that infrastructure that you're looking for, that enables the quality standards to be established, agreed upon, and promulgated as how the game needs to be played? What do you see from your perspective as an opportunity for that kind of convening?
Yeah, I mean, I look across institutions, and I think there actually is increasingly a critical mass. I think there is probably a critical mass of people out there. They need some guidance, some way to come together, because right now many of them are so busy as individual investigators trying to swim upstream it's essentially in a river that's filled with a different kind of fish than they are. Those that are just trying to the fish that are just making money without doing any real science and really not knowing whether they're giving a product that works. And so they're so busy dealing with that they're not able to spend the time that they need, perhaps, or there's no vehicle, a venue for them to connect up in the same way to really make progress as a network. There isn't, and I know, you know what I mean, there isn't a network in the same way, for instance, like, I mean, think about it for oncology, pediatric oncology, when it was back in the days when it was SWOG, you know, whether it was NSABP, all of those, you had groups of people put together that were able to make progress. And I think you do have enough investigators who really want to do this. They understand how challenging it is to work with cellular therapies. So that's great, because they understand that they're not going to have like the home run on day one. They want to work together, I think, if given the opportunity. But right now, they don't have a way to do that and remain whole as investigators. In other words, if they're not, they're trying to, you know, everyone needs to make a living, and they can't find a way to do that and move forward. So I think we need to find a way to make it so that they can find a way forward to do the type of research that's needed to get the answers here, because I think that slowed us down here. The fact that everyone's always trying to reach too far to get a home run and not just trying to get a good base hit. They're good. They're good. We need some of those, and that would bring this field and move it forward. And there have been, I think, I've been impressed that, you know, we're getting there, because I've seen a few base hits now, and I think we will start to see progress from them. But if we want to see that progress accelerate, we're going to need more collaboration and cooperation.
I want to continue on that, but maybe just kind of just one question, and then go on with this line. You mentioned the different kind of fish that they're having to swim with, and Peter, back earlier, you talked about how FDA had continued some of its enforcement discretion in this general area with pandemic. Anything more you want to say about what's going to happen to those other fish in the near or not so near?
Yeah, well, this has been a challenge, right? We even with I'm going to try not to get in trouble with any attorneys at FDA, and so I'm going to be very circumspect here about what I say, because we don't talk about ongoing litigation. But you know, right now there's been kind of even before the pandemic, there was a bit of a wait and see approach, because there was ongoing litigation, and there's been kind of this thought of, well, is FDA really going to be regulating here or not? But what I just wish we could move past that, because the answer is we are here to stay, because the products that actually work are drugs or biologics, and they have a mechanism of action that if you look at these cells the way they work like drugs, and so they probably should be regulated in a manner that's reasonable. Now, do they need to have, you know, can we find ways to streamline things? I think we really can, and I think that's something that I'm committed to working with the community on, so that, you know, we can find ways so that it's not as onerous for some of the cellular therapies to get through some of the hoops we have towards a biologics license application. But we do need to kind of move past this idea of, well, maybe they won't be regulating here, blah, blah, blah. Maybe we can kind of say that, you know, it's this kind of idea that that this concept that a stem cell can be used anywhere because stem cells can be anywhere. This to get around some of the issues of homologous use, and some of the tricks that people try to get around with manufacturing. I'd much rather find a regulatory framework that might be a little less stringent than we have currently in some ways, but yet capture the important things, which is ultimately keeping people safe, treating them with a quality product, and having them have an effective product as well, right? Quality, safety, efficacy. If we could facilitate that, then we've got it. Right now, what I do see though is that there still is a lot of wait and see, which means there's a lot of stuff going on that's still not right because people are making money giving products that they probably are not doing much.
So I mean to distract, but it is an important, I think, complementary topic. So more enforcement progress there, coupled with the kind of steps. I think Rob, Andy, I think maybe you both were going to comment on the suggestions about how to help the academic community get better aligned around. Maybe this could be coupled with some further guidance from Peter. You know, there has been progress here. I know some of the tools that FDA have developed to support the approval process, PATH, Interact, TRIP, and so forth. There are some foundations to build on, but I know you all look like you had some comments on how to get past this kind of fragmented and not so effective foundation for progress on the academic side.
I'll just push the concept that we were talking about in 21st Century Cures. It got sort of in there, and I know it was started, but I don't think it's robust enough yet. I think the FDA and NIH should form a network and fund a network which is totally focused on getting the trials done, because I don't think there's any shortage of great ideas. And in fact, from what I've seen preparing for this, there's some great trials of cell therapy for COVID are designed and ready to go. The key is, are we going to get the people enrolled and get the measurements made so we get clear, definitive answers? And to me, that's the number one thing. There's no shortage of brilliant people in the field. There's no shortage of great biology. There are now companies coming in. If we had a network that really worked together to enroll the patients to get clear answers so we could sort out all the BS from the stuff that works, I think that is the most important thing. Also, just wanted to comment, I can't resist. I'll see if all of you smile on this one. One of the things I loved about the FDA is you could go to meetings where a great idea was discussed, and everyone would say the public needs to know about this. And then I would have to argue with people for them to take credit in terms of putting their names on a paper or something. It's like our mission is the public health. It's not for me to personally get credit for something that something has been developed. That to me was so different than what I had experienced in academia, and it was very refreshing. Something that would reward that kind of behavior, I think, would make a big difference.
Be some middle ground there. Andy?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting that what I've seen happening with some of these trials is that because the pandemic's been moving around the country, unfortunately, by the time you get the trial underway, that patient population in that particular institution or center has changed, and you don't have the kind of access. So it sort of gets back to the point that Peter was alluding to earlier. One of the nice things in oncology was that you had cooperative groups, and you already sort of had the infrastructure in place. So once a protocol was agreed upon, it could be widely disseminated with still having the rigor and the discipline and the oversight that's required. So maybe one of those kinds of mechanisms would be with a critical mass of investigators who became a, if you will, cell therapy cooperative group of one type. Now, that may be a crazy idea, but we're looking for innovative solutions to what is, an emerging challenge. I think the point that Peter's making, though, is the real central role of the agency to really guide this process. And I know there has to be a firewall between how much you can facilitate and how much you have to regulate. But at the same time, I do think that we should be thinking through a way of supporting the agency so that it has the resources to play both those roles, to be the strong regulator, but at the same time to be the proactive facilitator. And I know that when you talk to credible sponsors or the industry, they want strong regulation. It does separate the quality from those who are trying to perhaps exploit the system. So there's nothing wrong with regulation, and the good players want regulation. They just want efficient and effective regulation, and I think that's what Peter's working towards.
Yeah. Let me ask about one related issue. So we've talked about better support, a network with hopefully clear guidance from the FDA and broad participation from as you were just saying, Andy, the academic leaders, and I think increasingly some commercial companies that want to do the right thing here. So that seems like a useful path forward on developing trial evidence. But as Peter said earlier, to some extent, this is a field that's more like devices, where they're going to be more incremental improvements along the way. And does that raise issues for how you design this network, and how to think about starting with singles and maybe going beyond it? Is there also a role for real world evidence, non-randomized, more as you know, there's been support for registries, the Marcus Foundation, others, and some support in 21st Century Cures for developing more data infrastructure that's not necessarily from a randomized context. Any of you want to comment on the potential for a combination approach here to developing better, better understood evidence?
Well, I think the iterative nature of this, I completely agree with Peter. It's sort of halfway between a traditional device and a drug, as far as I'm concerned. So it's critical that you not get stuck in non-adaptive approaches to clinical research. But those are moving quickly. And let me just point to coronary stents. I mean, there are a lot of arguments about when a coronary stent should be used. But if you are developing a new coronary stent now, you take it for granted you're going to do a real world randomized clinical trial compared to the old standard. And it gets done very quickly because the whole community is revved up and ready to go. And these trials get done quickly, and practice changes very quickly based on the results of the trials. And I don't know why this field couldn't have some of the same attributes of defining quality through the initial trials, and then adapting using methods that are readily available now for looking at interim data as you go along. So, and as for non-randomized real-world evidence, I think I think it's in the plan, right? That any medical product should have life cycle data, and the ability now to use electronic health records, for example, is going to make that easier and easier. So I'm all for it. What I'm not in favor of is shabby, poorly done stuff like was done with so many of the hydrochloroquine observational studies. It just doesn't, the methods are not suitable for drawing a causal inference. So let's don't pretend that we can, do magic with statistics. It's not possible. But that doesn't invalidate the need for registries or the use of real world data for various forms of causal inference.
Thanks. Now, I know we only have a few minutes left. Maybe turn to first Andy, Peter, and then maybe back to Rob for any final thoughts on this or other topics. It's been a good discussion about both the challenges of making progress in a pandemic, but also the opportunities for cellular and regenerative medicine. So really appreciate all the topics that you brought up. Any final thoughts to leave us with? Andy, maybe I can start with you.
Well, just that I think, cell therapies are a frontier, and they're going to be a critically important part of the future of medicine. And I think building the infrastructure that provides the rigor and the discipline for its development the informatics that need to go along with it, along with Rob's point that these are products that are going to have to be followed through their total life cycle and in the post-market. And I think the industries who are developing are going to have to be committed and prepared for that kind of ongoing surveillance, so that it's a constant learning process, so the agency is informed and can continue to provide the kind of regulation and facilitation that only it can provide.
Yeah, and it does seem like there are some good foundations to build on here. You know, we've mainly had an FDA focus for this session, understandably so, given the expertise and the importance of the of the regulatory oversight and the potential pathways for accelerating progress that can be created. I just add that from a CMS standpoint, CMS has recently made some new announcements related primarily to breakthrough devices, but is trying to set up a clearer, faster mechanism for coverage, but also for identifying where there are gaps in available evidence at the time of approval. So it seems like some real opportunities for synergies there on this life cycle approach. Peter, any final thoughts?
No, I just want to echo that I think that this really is an extremely exciting area. And despite some of the challenges of having this kind of noise of therapies that are not being studied appropriately, that are being sold, the core here of cellular therapies, I think the essence is really something that's worthwhile advancing. And I think as we have it advanced, we need to put in the infrastructure, just as been described, that will allow it to make the incremental progress and understand that we're not looking for a win next year. We're looking for the next 5 to 10 years to bring us the analytics, the production methods, the clinical studies that allow us to really allow these cellular therapies to reach their full potential.
Thank you. And Rob, any last minute final thought?
Hard to add anything to what's been said. I'm just hopeful that we will not succumb to sort of the chaotic approach, and that we will find ways to create pathways for the good stuff to win out. I mean, that's been the history of victories at the FDA, is creating rules for the game that make the players better, so that the better players win the game and not the lesser players. And I think we have a chance to do that in this field. And I'm hopeful there'll be a lot of creativity over the next year or two and how to make this happen.
And also some clear pathway and some challenges for those players to come together further to help make this more rapid progress. So thank you all, Andy, Rob. I know you all have tons of things going on, but Peter gets a special thanks given just how central CBER is right now. I want to thank you for all you're doing, especially the staff who I know are working really hard on some difficult issues, a lot in the public eye and a lot of attention. Thanks for all you're doing for the country, and really appreciate your being part of this panel as well. And then a final thanks to the Alliance for Cell Therapy Now, the Regenerative Medicine Foundation, the Cord Blood Association for bringing us together as part of this virtual event on exploring public policy, regenerative medicine, and cell therapies. Hopefully more progress soon. Critically important area. Thank you all.
Take care.
Take care. Thank you.
Bye.